Imagine walking into a crowded room. Laughter echoing, conversations overlapping, people naturally forming circles, and yet somehow you stand outside all of it. Not because you're awkward, not because you're unwanted, but because you see something others don't. You notice the forced smiles, the subtle power games, the invisible hierarchy forming in seconds. And in that moment you realize, maybe having few friends isn't a weakness. Maybe it's a sign that your mind operates differently. History quietly agrees. Niccolò Machiavelli spent much of his life observing people rather than belonging to them. He watched rulers pretend loyalty, allies betray each other, and friendships dissolve when power shifted. He understood something uncomfortable. The more clearly you see human nature, the harder it becomes to casually connect. Because connection requires illusion, and clarity destroys illusion. So if you've ever felt like you don't naturally fit into social circles, if your phone stays silent longer than others, if you prefer solitude over shallow company, there's a strong chance you don't lack social ability. You simply possess rare psychological traits most people don't. Traits that make you selective. Traits that make you observant. Traits that make you difficult to manipulate. Traits that quietly set you apart. And the first one begins in silence. There is a certain kind of person who doesn't rush to fill empty space. When conversation stops, they don't panic. When a room becomes quiet, they don't scramble to speak. Instead, they observe. They watch micro-expressions. They notice who looks at who interrupts, who dominates, who submits. While others perform, they analyze. This creates distance. Most social bonding happens through fast, emotional, impulsive communication. People laugh quickly, agree quickly, trust quickly. But when your mind naturally slows things down, when you internally evaluate every interaction, you don't move at the same speed. And because of that, people sometimes misinterpret you. They assume you're distant. They assume you're cold. They assume you're uninterested. But the truth is far more complex. You're not disengaged. You're calculating. Machiavelli once observed that rulers who speak less are often feared more. Not because silence is intimidating by itself, but because silence creates uncertainty. When people don't know what you're thinking, they project their own assumptions onto you, and that projection gives you invisible power. This same principle applies socially. When you don't overshare, people can't categorize you easily. When you don't gossip, they can't predict your loyalties. When you don't react emotionally, they can't manipulate your feelings. So instead of naturally bonding with you, they keep distance. Not consciously, but instinctively. And this is why people with few friends often possess deep observational intelligence. You don't just hear words. You hear intentions behind words. You don't just see smiles. You detect tension inside smiles. You don't just notice kindness. You notice when kindness is strategic. This level of perception changes everything. Because once you see through social performance, casual friendships lose their appeal. The small talk feels repetitive. The forced enthusiasm feels exhausting. The shallow validation feels meaningless. You begin to crave something rarer, authenticity. But authenticity is scarce. Most people bond through shared environments, shared habits, shared entertainment. Very few bond through shared depth. So when your mind seeks depth, your social circle naturally shrinks. Not because you reject people, but because fewer people match your frequency. This is the quiet paradox. The more perceptive you are, the fewer people feel natural to be around. The more you understand human behavior, the less you enjoy surface-level interaction. The more you value authenticity, the harder it becomes to find it. And slowly, without realizing, you become comfortable being alone. But this isn't loneliness. It's controlled solitude. There's a major psychological difference between someone who is alone because they're excluded and someone who is alone because they choose selectively. One feels empty, the other feels peaceful. One seeks validation, the other seeks clarity. Machiavelli understood this deeply. After being removed from political power, he spent long periods isolated from the social circles he once moved in. But instead of chasing acceptance, he studied human nature. He wrote, he reflected, he sharpened his understanding. And from that solitude emerged insights that still influence psychology, leadership, and power dynamics today. Solitude didn't weaken him. It refined him. This is what happens when you naturally have few friends. Your mental energy isn't scattered across dozens of shallow relationships. Instead, it turns inward. You think more. You analyze more. You develop stronger internal dialogue. You become less dependent on external validation. And that independence subtly changes your behavior. You don't agree just to belong. You don't laugh just to fit in. You don't pretend just to be accepted. You choose honesty over popularity. And honesty is socially expensive. Most groups function on unspoken agreements. Everyone plays a role. Everyone maintains a certain illusion. When someone refuses to follow those invisible rules, it creates discomfort. Not because they did something wrong, but because they expose what others are unconsciously hiding. So people distance themselves. Not aggressively, not intentionally, just quietly. And over time you notice something interesting. You don't have many friends, but the few connections you do have feel unusually deep. Conversations go beyond surface topics. Silence isn't awkward. Trust builds slowly but strongly. These relationships aren't frequent, but they're meaningful. This is the hidden advantage. Having few friends often means you invest more into each one. You listen more carefully. You remember details. You observe changes in tone, behavior, and mood. Your friendships become less about entertainment and more about understanding. But because this process takes time, your circle stays small. And that leads to the second subtle shift. You become highly selective without realizing it. You start filtering people instinctively. You sense insincerity faster. You detect inconsistency in behavior. You notice when someone's words don't match their actions. This mental filtering happens automatically, almost subconsciously. So while others form friendships quickly, you hesitate, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Machiavelli once warned that people reveal their true nature when their interests change. Someone loyal today may turn tomorrow if incentives shift. Someone kind today may become hostile if power dynamics change. Once you internalize this idea, you stop trusting quickly. Not because you're cynical, but because you understand human adaptability. And this understanding protects you. You don't get pulled into unnecessary drama. You don't become emotionally invested in unstable personalities. You don't reveal your vulnerabilities to people who haven't earned your trust. As a result, your social life appears smaller, but psychologically safer. This is why people with few friends often appear calm even in chaotic environments. They aren't entangled in multiple emotional obligations. They don't carry the weight of maintaining dozens of connections. Their emotional bandwidth remains controlled, and control creates clarity. You think before reacting. You observe before judging. You understand before trusting. These habits slowly shape your identity. Others may see you as reserved, but internally, you're deeply engaged. You're constantly reading energy, tone, body language, and subtle dynamics. You learn more about people in silence than most learn in conversation. This is not social weakness. This is quiet psychological strength. Because the ability to be alone without feeling empty is rare, most people seek constant distraction. They fill silence with noise. They fill time with company. They fill uncertainty with conversation. But when you're comfortable with few friends, you become comfortable with yourself. And once that happens, something powerful changes. You stop needing approval. You no longer shape your opinions based on group consensus. You no longer change behavior to match expectations. You no longer fear being misunderstood. Your identity becomes internally anchored rather than socially constructed. Machiavelli admired this kind of independence in rulers. Leaders who depended on public affection were unstable. Leaders who relied on inner conviction were harder to influence. The same principle applies to individuals. When your self-worth doesn't depend on social quantity, your decisions become more deliberate. You choose quality over popularity, depth over noise, understanding over validation. And that is why having few friends is often misunderstood. From the outside, it looks like isolation. From the inside, it feels like clarity. But this clarity comes with a cost. Because when you see people clearly, you also see their contradictions. You notice when someone praises loyalty but abandons friends. You notice when someone speaks about honesty but manipulates situations. You notice when someone appears confident but seeks validation constantly. These observations slowly change how you interact. You speak less. You reveal less. You trust slowly. You bond carefully. And without realizing, your social world becomes quieter, but more meaningful. This is where the rare pattern begins to form. People with few friends often aren't socially incapable. They're socially selective. They aren't disconnected. They're deeply perceptive. They aren't lonely. They're internally fulfilled. And this is only the beginning. Because the next trait that quietly appears in people with few friends is even more powerful. It changes how you think, how you react, and how others perceive you, even before you say a single word. And that next trait begins with something most people avoid: comfort with being misunderstood. When you have many friends, your identity is constantly reinforced. People mirror your jokes, validate your opinions, and confirm your behavior. You become accustomed to being seen a certain way. But when your social circle is small, that reinforcement disappears. There are long stretches where no one reflects your identity back to you. No one constantly reassures you. No one continuously interprets your intentions, so something unusual happens. You stop needing to be understood. At first, this feels uncomfortable. You explain yourself more. You clarify your intentions. You try to make people see what you really meant. But over time, you notice something. The more you explain, the less it changes. People still interpret you based on their own perception, their own bias, their own emotional state. And slowly, you let go. You stop correcting every misunderstanding. You stop defending every opinion. You stop chasing approval. You allow people to think what they want. This creates a powerful psychological shift. Most people carefully manage how others perceive them. They shape their words to avoid misinterpretation. They soften opinions to maintain harmony. They adjust behavior to fit expectations. But when you're comfortable having few friends, you no longer rely on mass perception. You rely on self-definition. Machiavelli wrote about rulers who accepted being misunderstood by the public. He observed that leaders who tried to please everyone lost authority. But leaders who acted decisively, even when criticized, often maintained power. Because consistency commands respect, even when agreement is absent. This principle quietly appears in people with few friends. You don't constantly edit yourself. You don't perform social roles. You don't exaggerate personality for approval. You become consistent, and consistency makes you hard to manipulate. When someone praises you, you don't immediately open up. When someone criticizes you, you don't collapse. When someone distances themselves, you don't panic. Your emotional stability doesn't depend on external reactions. It comes from internal alignment. This makes your presence unusual. People notice that you don't chase conversations. You don't force connection. You don't react dramatically to social shifts. And because of that, others begin to project confidence onto you, even if you never intended to appear confident. This is the quiet power of independence. The less you need attention, the more intriguing you become. The less you seek approval, the more authentic you appear. The less you react emotionally, the more stable you seem. And stability attracts curiosity. But this trait also deepens your solitude. Because when you don't actively seek validation, you don't engage in the small rituals that maintain casual friendships. You don't message just to fill silence. You don't check in without reason. You don't maintain constant digital presence. Your communication becomes intentional, not habitual. And many people interpret this as distance. They assume you're uninterested. They assume you don't care. They assume you prefer isolation. But internally, you're simply selective with energy. You understand something most people don't consciously realize. Attention is limited. Emotional investment is limited. Time is limited. And spreading those across too many people weakens depth. So you naturally concentrate your energy where it matters. This concentration creates intensity. Your conversations become deeper. Your observations become sharper. Your bonds become stronger, but fewer. Machiavelli once described how alliances built slowly tend to last longer than alliances built quickly. When trust forms gradually, it's rooted in observation rather than emotion. And observation is harder to break than impulse. People with few friends often operate this way without realizing it. They don't bond instantly. They study behavior over time. They watch consistency. They observe reactions under pressure. Only after repeated signals do they allow closeness. This patience filters out instability. And over time, you begin noticing another shift. You become comfortable with silence in relationships. Most friendships rely on constant interaction, messages every day, updates every hour, reassurance through frequency. But when you have few friends, your connections don't depend on constant contact. You can go days, even weeks without speaking. And nothing feels broken, because the bond isn't built on activity. It's built on understanding. This type of connection is rare. It doesn't need performance. It doesn't require constant emotional exchange. It exists quietly, without pressure. And this makes your relationships feel calm rather than chaotic. But again, this reduces quantity, because many people interpret silence as disinterest. They expect continuous engagement. They measure closeness through frequency. When they don't receive that, they drift away. And you let them, not out of indifference, but out of acceptance. You understand that forced connection is fragile. And that understanding leads to another rare trait: emotional self-sufficiency. When your social circle is small, you don't always have someone available to share every thought. You don't immediately vent every frustration. You don't constantly seek reassurance. Instead, you process internally. You reflect. You analyze. You calm yourself. This builds emotional independence. You become your own sounding board. You become your own reassurance. You become your own stabilizer. Machiavelli believed leaders must master their emotions privately. Public emotional dependence signaled weakness. Internal composure signaled strength. Similarly, when you develop emotional self-sufficiency, your reactions become measured. You don't explode impulsively. You don't overshare vulnerability. You handle pressure quietly. This creates an aura of calm. Others may not know what you're feeling, but they sense you're composed. Even in tense situations, you don't panic. Even in conflict, you remain controlled. And this composure makes you appear emotionally strong. But strength often creates distance. People sometimes feel unsure how to approach someone who seems internally stable. They don't know what you need. They don't know how to relate. And so they keep interactions surface level. Meanwhile, you're comfortable either way, because you don't depend on external emotional support. This is one of the rarest psychological traits, the ability to be alone with your thoughts without feeling overwhelmed. Many people avoid solitude because their minds become noisy. But when you're used to few friendships, solitude becomes familiar. Your thoughts become organized. Your inner dialogue becomes structured. You learn from your own mind. You replay conversations. You analyze patterns. You understand motives. You refine judgment. This self-reflection sharpens perception even further. You start noticing behavioral patterns quickly. Someone who flatters everyone. Someone who shifts personality depending on the group. Someone who dominates conversations. Someone who subtly seeks validation. These patterns become obvious. And once you see them, you can't unsee them. Casual socializing becomes predictable. You know how conversations will unfold. You know how dynamics will form. You know who will lead, who will follow, who will agree, who will resist. This predictive ability makes interaction less stimulating and more observational. And again, your circle stays small, but your understanding grows deeper. Machiavelli studied patterns like this in political courts. He watched how personalities repeated across different people. The ambitious one, the loyal one, the manipulative one, the insecure one. He realized human behavior follows predictable structures. And once you understand those structures, you stop being surprised. This is what happens when you naturally have few friends. You spend more time observing behavior than participating in it. An observation builds psychological insight. You begin understanding motivations beneath actions. You recognize insecurity behind arrogance. You detect fear behind aggression. You see need behind attention-seeking. This empathy is quiet, but powerful, because when you truly understand people, you don't react impulsively. You don't take everything personally. You don't assume hostility instantly. You analyze context. You interpret intention. You respond deliberately. This calm response changes how others see you. You appear mature. You appear thoughtful. You appear difficult to provoke. And being difficult to provoke is rare. Most social groups operate on emotional reactions. Someone jokes, someone reacts. Someone criticizes, someone defends. Someone boasts, someone competes. But when you remain calm, you step outside that loop. You don't feed the emotional chain. This makes you unpredictable, and unpredictability commands subtle respect. People don't know how you'll react, because you don't follow typical emotional patterns. You might stay silent where others argue. You might smile where others get offended. You might disengage where others escalate. This controlled unpredictability makes your presence unique. But again, unique often means fewer connections, because fitting into groups requires predictability. Groups rely on shared emotional rhythms. When someone doesn't follow those rhythms, they remain slightly outside. Not rejected, just different. And over time, you become comfortable with that difference. You stop trying to blend. You stop forcing relatability. You stop mimicking group behavior. You remain yourself, even if it means standing alone. And this is where another rare trait quietly forms. Your tolerance for solitude transforms into preference. You begin enjoying your own company. You enjoy thinking without interruption. You enjoy observing without participating. You enjoy calm environments over noisy ones. This preference changes lifestyle choices. You choose smaller gatherings. You choose meaningful conversations. You choose quiet routines. You choose depth over excitement. And gradually, you build a life that doesn't require many people, but feels complete. This is the hidden truth. Having few friends doesn't always mean lacking connection. Sometimes it means your connection style is rare. You don't bond through constant presence. You bond through understanding. You don't seek quantity. You seek resonance. And when you finally meet someone who resonates, the connection feels effortless. No performance, no pressure, just clarity. These rare bonds may be few, but they're powerful. Machiavelli believed that true alliances are not measured by number, but by reliability. A ruler with many allies but little loyalty was vulnerable. A ruler with few allies but strong loyalty was stable. The same applies socially. Few meaningful relationships often outweigh many superficial ones. But there's still another trait forming quietly, one that shapes how you make decisions, how you trust, and how you move through the world without needing constant social confirmation. And once this trait develops, having few friends no longer feels unusual at all. It begins to feel intentional. And when it begins to feel intentional, something subtle but powerful takes shape. You stop following the crowd, not as an act of rebellion, but as a natural consequence of independent thinking. Most people unconsciously calibrate their decisions through social consensus. They look around before forming opinions. They adjust their beliefs to align with the group. They measure what's acceptable by observing what others accept. This is not weakness. It's human nature. Social belonging has always meant survival. But when you have few friends, that constant calibration disappears. You don't have a large circle influencing your decisions daily. You don't hear the same opinions repeated around you. You don't absorb group thinking unconsciously. So your mind begins to operate differently. You think from first principles. You evaluate ideas individually. You question assumptions instinctively. This creates independence of judgment. And independence is rare, because it's uncomfortable. When your opinions differ from the majority, you lose easy validation. When your choices don't follow trends, you lose easy approval. When your mindset doesn't mirror others, you lose instant relatability. But if you're already comfortable having few friends, this discomfort doesn't control you. You're already used to standing slightly apart. Machiavelli observed that rulers who depended on public opinion were easily manipulated. But those who formed decisions based on calculated understanding maintained control. They were not driven by applause or fear of criticism. They were guided by internal logic. This same principle quietly shapes people with small social circles. You don't adopt ideas just because they're popular. You don't reject ideas just because they're unpopular. You analyze, and analysis slows your reactions. When a new trend appears, you observe before participating. When someone shares gossip, you question before believing. When conflict arises, you understand before choosing sides. This deliberate processing creates emotional neutrality. You don't rush to defend people blindly. You don't rush to attack people impulsively. You don't rush to align yourself with group sentiment. You remain centered. And this centered behavior makes you appear composed, but also distant. Because group bonding often happens through shared reactions. People laugh together, criticize together, get excited together. When you don't automatically join these reactions, you remain slightly outside the emotional loop, not excluded, just independent. This independence slowly forms another rare trait: resistance to peer pressure. When you don't rely on many friendships for identity, you don't feel the same urgency to conform. You don't need to agree to maintain acceptance. You don't need to participate to maintain belonging. You can simply observe and decide. This creates quiet confidence. You're comfortable saying less. You're comfortable disagreeing calmly. You're comfortable choosing differently. And this calm confidence often surprises people. Because you don't present it aggressively. You don't argue loudly. You don't dominate conversations. You simply remain steady in your perspective. Machiavelli believed that the most effective influence is quiet influence. Loud authority invites resistance. Calm certainty invites respect. When someone holds a position without emotional defensiveness, others subconsciously perceive strength. This is what happens when your mindset develops outside constant social reinforcement. Your beliefs aren't fragile. They aren't dependent on agreement. They're built through reflection, and reflection makes them stable. But this stability also reduces your need for constant interaction. You don't seek conversations just to confirm your opinions. You don't seek groups just to feel validated. You don't seek attention just to feel seen. You already feel grounded, and grounded individuals naturally move slower socially. They don't jump into every opportunity. They don't chase every connection. They evaluate quietly. They choose selectively. This slow pace makes your social circle smaller, but stronger. And then another shift appears. You become comfortable walking away. Most people stay in friendships out of habit. They tolerate misalignment to avoid loneliness. They maintain connection even when it drains them. But when you're already used to having few friends, you don't fear reduction. You value alignment over continuity. If someone becomes inconsistent, you notice. If someone becomes manipulative, you distance. If someone becomes negative, you disengage. Not dramatically, not angrily, just calmly. Machiavelli warned that loyalty should be given carefully and withdrawn quietly. Public conflict creates chaos. Silent distance preserves control. People with small circles often follow this instinct naturally. They don't escalate unnecessary drama. They simply reduce access. This ability protects your mental space. You don't remain trapped in toxic dynamics. You don't maintain relationships out of guilt. You don't sacrifice peace for popularity, and because of that, your environment stays calm. Calm environments reinforce introspection. Introspection strengthens self-awareness, and self-awareness forms another rare trait. You understand your own nature deeply. You know when you need space. You know when you need conversation. You know what drains you. You know what energizes you. This clarity prevents social exhaustion. You don't overcommit. You don't overextend. You don't overwhelm yourself with obligations. Your social interactions become intentional, not reactive. And intentional interaction is powerful. Because when you do engage, you're fully present. You listen carefully. You speak thoughtfully. You observe deeply. Your conversations feel meaningful, even if brief. People notice this quality. They sense you're not distracted. You're not performing. You're genuinely attentive. This makes your presence memorable. Ironically, having few friends often makes your interactions more impactful. You don't dilute your attention across many people. You focus. And focused attention is rare in a distracted world. Machiavelli often emphasized that attention reveals intention. When someone observes carefully, they gain advantage. When someone listens more than they speak, they understand more than they reveal. This balance creates subtle influence. People with small circles naturally develop this balance. They listen first. They analyze. Then they speak. And when they speak, their words carry weight. Because they aren't frequent. They're deliberate. This deliberate communication shapes perception. Others begin seeing you as thoughtful, measured, difficult to read, calmly confident. And being difficult to read creates intrigue. People often become curious about someone who doesn't reveal everything, someone who doesn't overshare, someone who remains composed. This curiosity sometimes draws others toward you. But you don't automatically expand your circle. You still filter. Because by now, your selectiveness is instinctive. You don't chase connection. You allow it. You don't force closeness. You let it grow. You don't open quickly. You observe first. This patience is rare in fast social environments. And as this patience deepens, another transformation happens. You stop measuring your life by social quantity. You don't count how many friends you have. You don't compare your social activity. You don't feel pressure to appear connected. You measure depth instead. One meaningful conversation outweighs 10 shallow ones. One loyal connection outweighs many casual ones. One peaceful evening outweighs crowded noise. This shift removes social anxiety. You no longer worry about being alone. You no longer interpret silence as rejection. You no longer fear missing out. You become internally complete. Machiavelli understood that self-sufficient leaders are hardest to manipulate. When someone doesn't depend on external approval, pressure loses power. The same applies here. When you don't depend on many friendships, you move freely. You choose honestly. You live deliberately. And this is why having few or no friends often hides rare psychological traits. You're comfortable in silence. You're selective with trust. You're independent in thought. You're calm under pressure. You're resistant to manipulation. You're emotionally self-sufficient. You value depth over quantity. These traits don't isolate you. They refine you. Because the truth is, anyone can be surrounded by people. But not everyone can be alone and still feel grounded. Not everyone can think independently without group support. Not everyone can observe without reacting. Not everyone can trust slowly and deeply. These qualities develop quietly, often in solitude. So if your circle is small, if your phone isn't constantly buzzing, if your life feels quieter than others, it may not be because you lack social ability. It may be because your mind naturally filters what doesn't resonate. It may be because you prefer authenticity over convenience. It may be because you see people clearly, and clarity narrows connection. Machiavelli once implied that understanding human nature creates distance, but also control. The more you see, the less you're pulled unconsciously. The less you're pulled, the more deliberate you become. And the more deliberate you become, the fewer, but stronger, your connections become. So having few friends isn't always absence. Sometimes it's precision. And in the end, everything comes back to a quiet realization. Having few or no friends is not always a social failure. Sometimes it's a psychological filter, because when you stop chasing noise, you begin hearing clarity. When you stop forcing connection, you begin recognizing authenticity. When you stop fearing solitude, you begin discovering yourself. Most people move through life surrounded by voices, opinions, expectations, and invisible pressure. Their identity forms from reflection, from how others react, approve, or disagree. But when your circle is small, that mirror disappears. And without that mirror, you're forced to build something rare, an identity that exists without constant validation. This is why people with few friends often become unusually self-aware. You learn your own patterns. You understand your own emotions. You recognize your own boundaries. You develop your own standards. And once you build that internal foundation, your life stops revolving around social quantity. You no longer measure your worth by how many people surround you. You measure it by how peaceful you feel, how clear your thinking is, how aligned your decisions become. Machiavelli understood this long before modern psychology gave it a name. He saw that those who understand people deeply often stand slightly apart from them, not because they hate others, but because they see beyond performance. They see ambition behind kindness, fear behind arrogance, insecurity behind dominance. And once you see these patterns, blind attachment becomes difficult. So instead of bonding quickly, you bond carefully. Instead of trusting easily, you trust slowly. Instead of needing many, you value a few. And that changes everything, because a small circle built on understanding is stronger than a large circle built on convenience. A quiet mind is stronger than a noisy environment. And a person who can stand alone without feeling empty carries a kind of strength most people never develop. So if you look around and notice your circle is smaller than others, don't rush to assume something is missing. Look deeper. You may be more observant, more selective, more emotionally independent, more resistant to manipulation, more comfortable with truth than illusion. You may not connect with everyone, but when you do connect, it's real. You may not speak often, but when you do, it carries weight. You may not chase attention, but your presence is remembered. And maybe that was never loneliness. Maybe it was refinement. Maybe it was clarity. Maybe it was strength forming quietly, in the space where noise couldn't reach. Because in a world where everyone is trying to be seen, the rarest person is the one who doesn't need to be.